This week we had a Toyota come in with a bad wheel bearing that gave us a bit of a struggle. And I've got the rod cap safety wired on the Fordson tractor. Not much work was done on the 48 Chevy, but we'll definitely have more to share with you on it next week.
I'm replacing the gaskets for the oil distributor on the side of the block. There were no signs of leaking, but we're replacing the gaskets anyways.
One of my past graduates, Mike Pigg, brought in this 04 Corolla for a front wheel bearing service. And when he got it here and pulled it apart, he noticed that the right front wheel was dragging pretty badly. Right now, it's been sitting here for about 15 or 20 minutes and still too hot to the touch. It's been dragging so much. So it's going to need a caliper and a hose and definitely a rotor along with the wheel bearing service.
Hot fella hanging out there. Holy crap, it's warm.
The first step is to remove the axle nut. Now I'm pulling the lower strut bolts from the knuckle.
This is done to remove the axle shaft so the bearing can be removed. With the axle out of the way, the steering knuckle is bolted back to the lower strut to make it easier to pull the
Slide that up a
flange.
little bit. Give us some good. We have a nice solid work. This is a slide hammer we're installing here to pull the hub from the knuckle. This one's a little overkill for this particular job, but it's what we have.
Edmar's putting the lug nuts on to the puller so the slide hammer can remove the flange.
You'll hear the pitch change. You hear it tap, tap, and it'll kind of get to like a duller tap. That's when it's actually coming loose. When it does that, slow down. Otherwise you end up over there with it.
Okay.
Good. 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 Lower it down just a little bit.
As I mentioned in the beginning, this bearing wasn't coming easily, so Mike had to get involved. Fender cover was used to make it a little easier on his hands.
There it goes.
As with most cases, the inner race comes out with the hub, so here you can see the outer ring of ball bearing. Mike's got an on-car bearing press that he brought with him. So he's got everything set up to accept the bearing to get pushed out. So let's get our impact gun and get her pressed. That bearing was in there pretty tight, so what we're doing now is removing the whole knuckle so we can use a stationary press to press it apart. So he's got the tie rod nut off, and he's going to take the ball joint loose. We'll separate them and put it to a press. We use a pickle fork to separate the tie rod and then the ball joint.
Back here.
Yep. Edmar's putting pinch pliers on the brake hose so he can remove the caliper because we're going to replace it. We're also replacing the hose, but this will keep from losing all the brake fluid while we're waiting on the new caliper to get here. This is the outer race of the bearing that we just pressed out. So between the air chisel and our 20-ton press, we were able to finally get this thing out. Most of them aren't quite this difficult. Mike's got it set up just to keep the bearing pressed and started. And once it goes in square, we'll readjust our tooling to get it pressed in all the way. Mike's using the old race as a press. It's the same diameter. You always want to press from the outside of the bearing. You're pressing on the outside race. Once it gets it pressed against the shoulder of the hub, and we know we're clear enough that we can get the snap ring in. Using a cutoff wheel to strike a line in the inner race that's still on the hub. So now I've got a nice groove in here. I'm going to take the air chisel and bump it, and it should split it for us.
But it's case hard.
Just like that. Now we can push it straight off. Here's the old inner race. You can see where I cut with the cutoff wheel and the crack there at the top after we hit it with a chisel. New bearing's in with the snap ring, so now Kevin's going to press the hub in place. I'm supporting from the back side on the inner race so that we don't press the bearing back through and ruin the new bearing. So what Kevin's doing is he's feeling for the consistency of the press. And if he feels it get more difficult to pull, then we'll have to stop and see what's going on. But it looks like it's moving really smoothly.
There you go, beautiful. Feel that started getting tight? That's perfect.
It's down tight and the bearing feels smooth as we spin it, and we'll put it back on the car.
Check your spacing there, nice and clear, and I'm going to look at the back side also. Looks like we're pretty much there.
With the new bearing installed, it's time to put the knuckle back on. Ball joint goes in and the tie rod, and then we'll get the top put back together after the axle shaft goes in. This is stuff you've seen us do before, but you always need to make sure that you get all the cosmoline off of the new rotor. So you clean both sides with a clean rag and brake clean before installing it onto the car. Like I see, we got our new cotter pins put on, the tie rod and our ball joint as well. And that is the correct way to install a cotter pin. You've seen us do that before. Kevin's putting a little anti-seize where the brake pads are going to go. That'll help them to slide. Hit it. replacing the line also, Kevin's got his line wrench on. He's going to loosen it, loosen the fitting at the line. You want to be careful to make sure that the line doesn't twist with the fitting. The fitting should move independently. If you see the line move, then you're going to have to stop and get it freed up, because if you twist the line, then that whole line is going to have to be replaced. Now Kevin's got the line loose, he's going to pull this clip, and then that should remove the line, and we can put the new one on. With the new line installed, he's tightening up the hard line going to the rubber hose. You can see we've got our line on the other end of the caliper with our 2 new copper washers. Now he'll get that tight, and he'll tighten the line up at the strut. Then it'll be time to bleed it. Alright, with the new line installed and everything in place, we're going to bleed this side out. It should be ready to go. Alright, Kevin's got his torque wrench set to 159 pound-feet to tighten the axle nut. Mike's inside the car holding the brake pedal. Now it's really important to make sure that you do torque the axle nut and not just hit it with an impact gun, because what it'll do is try to push the inner race towards the bearings and take out the preload, and then you'll have a bearing that's going to fail very soon. So you should never use an impact gun to install an axle nut. Wheel goes on to finish the job. We'll get it torqued down and we'll take the car for a test drive.
I've got most of the Nova block sanded. There's still a couple dents that need a repair.
You see this small dent here, circled with a pin, and a small crease here on the other side.
Once those are repaired, it'll be ready for its final coats of primer. I put some body filler on this small dent. Now I'm block sanding it with 220.
As always, you'll notice that he is sanding in angle directions, and he'll switch the directions periodically. You never want to sand horizontally or vertically, because that'll make the repair wavy.
The last repair that needs to be made to the body is a couple of rust holes in the door. I'm using a sandblaster to remove the rust scale before making the repair.
That's going to give us a good base for our fiberglass to stick to. Something else you've seen us do before, Alejandro, is saturating the fiberglass with resin before he puts it onto the car. With it saturated, he's going to transfer it over to the door. He's taking the brush and pushing out all the air bubbles. And then once it sets off, he'll grind all those down, and we'll put a little bit of body filler over it. That'll complete the repair, except we're going to go in from the back side next time to help seal it on both sides so that it can't rust again. So again, once this kicks off, we'll be ready to grind it and finish it. You can see those 2 teeth on the crank gear are broke off, and there's some pitting on some of the other ones there. So I'm going to call the Fordson house up in Michigan and have a new crank gear sent to me. With all the shims and rod caps in place and tightened down, it's time to put the safety wire on them as well. So I've got my section of safety wire cut. I'm going to put it through the hole in the stud. Remember, like we've done this before, we're going to keep the ends just about even. And then wrap this around the castle nut, like so. So with this wrapped like that, what I'm going to do now is come down to the other one below it, and I'm going to go just about to the end of it, just a touch more than would be necessary to get through the hole, because once we twist it, it's going to shorten it, obviously. So we'll tighten that, lock this in place, Alright, then I'm going to pull this direction because I want to keep it wrapped around the nut and begin the twisting process. It's looking pretty good. Alright, now I'll release this. And now I'm going to come down around this side. I'm going to take one end, doesn't really matter, and go back through this hole. I'm going to bring that around. Gotta make sure we pull it tight. I can use the pliers to do that. Definitely want to keep everything tight to this point. Then I'll wrap the nut on the bottom like so. A little shorter than I want to be, but it'll be okay. Alright, so now I'll grab these two like that. Lock it down again. Actually, I think I missed it. You gotta be really careful to make sure that you do get both of them in the pliers before you lock the handle. Okay, and then I'm going to pull this direction, keeping that wire under the nut. Twist it gently. So we're just about pretty tight. That's pretty good there. If you keep going with it, it'll eventually snap the wire, even though it is strong. So now I'm going to release the handle like that. I'm going to cut off my excess with a pair of side cutters. Then I'm going to fold this over, like we talked about last time. Now, since none of these are external, we don't have to worry about cutting our fingers on them once the oil pan's on it. So we still want to do it the correct way anyway. Then we'll tuck that under like so, and it's nice and tight. So again, as we explained before, if this nut tries to loosen, it's going to pull this one tight. And if this one tries to loosen, it's going to pull this one tight. So it keeps each the nuts in check. And as you've seen, we've done the mains as well. We did those a while back. But this is how you safety wire these two together so that they can't back off during operation. Next time on Bulldog Builds, we'll have more work done on our 48 Chevy. We'll get the door repair finished on our 69 Nova. And that truck with the battery drain will be back for us to finish it. See you next week.